Buckingham Palace does not summon four senior royals to a locked room without reason. This time the reason had a name, a charity ledger, and a signature nobody in the family recognized. Before we go further, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when a king chooses the crown over the woman beside him. Charles had called it a private briefing. The word private did a great deal of work that morning. Advisors waited outside the door instead of inside it. A folder sat closed on the table, its edges squared with military precision, as if precision could soften what was written underneath. William arrived first. He took the seat nearest the door, old habit, the instinct of a man who still checks exits in rooms he's owned his whole life. Catherine sat beside him. She said nothing. She had learned over the years that silence in this family was its own language, and she was fluent now. Anne arrived last, carrying a second folder, thinner, sealed with her own hand, not the palace offices. Charles opened the meeting the way he opened most difficult things, quietly, and without warning anyone that difficult was coming. He said Camilla would step back from her patronages effective immediately. Not a pause, not a review, a full and public withdrawal from the charitable work that had, for over a decade, been the one thing entirely hers. William's jaw moved, just that. A small mechanical thing, like a door easing shut on a hinge that needed oil. Catherine's hand found the edge of the table. Anne did not react at all, which was its own kind of reaction, the stillness of someone who already knew and had known for weeks, and had simply been waiting for her brother to catch up. Camilla was not in the room. She was 2 floors up, in an office with a view of the garden she rarely had time to look at, reading a letter that used the phrase with immediate effect 3 times, as if repetition could make the words gentler. She read it once standing. Then she sat down, which is its own kind of collapse dressed up as composure. She did not cry. She reached instead for the small brass letter opener on her desk, a gift, years old, engraved with initials that weren't hers, and turned it over in her hand while she read the letter a second time. The letter opener mattered more than the letter did. She would not have been able to explain why. Downstairs, the family had already moved past the announcement and into its aftermath, which is where the real fracture always lives, underneath the headline, in the small mechanics of who now does what. William asked, flatly, whether Catherine would be expected to absorb the patronages. Charles said some, not all. Catherine said nothing, opened her calendar app on her phone, and stared at the blank week ahead like it was a diagnosis. Anne finally spoke. She said the family needed to know why, not the sanitized version, the actual one, before anyone downstairs started inventing their own. Charles looked at the sealed folder in his sister's hands, and for the first time that morning, looked like a man rather than a monarch. He asked her to open it. The story the country would eventually hear started 3 weeks earlier, in a room with better lighting and worse consequences. A veterans' housing charity, one of Camilla's oldest patronages, the kind of cause that had followed her from before the crown, back when she was simply a woman with a cause and no title attached to make it newsworthy. The charity had a renovation fund, $500,000, ring-fenced for a housing complex outside Portsmouth, modest by royal adjacent standards, enormous to the families waiting for keys. Camilla had approved a redirection of £40,000 toward what the paperwork called ceremonial enhancement costs, a gala, new signage, a commemorative garden nobody had asked for, built around a fountain nobody needed. The paperwork carried her signature, not her office's, hers. Anne had found it during a routine trustee review, the kind of tedious oversight work nobody envies her for, and the kind that, this once, mattered more than a state visit. She hadn't gone to Camilla first, she'd gone to Charles. That detail sat in the room like a held breath. Camilla would learn, eventually, that her husband had known for 11 days before he said a word to her. 11 days is not a number. It's a decision, worn thin by repetition. Charles confronted her that evening, not in the study, not with witnesses, in the small sitting room where they took breakfast, because he wanted the conversation to happen somewhere that still, technically, belonged to both of them. He placed the ledger between the teacups. She looked at it the way you look at a photograph of yourself, from an angle you didn't know existed. She didn't deny the signature. She explained it instead. The gala had been meant to attract new donors, the fountain a gesture to a benefactor whose continued support the charity needed, the numbers small enough, she'd assumed, to never require a conversation like this one. Charles asked whether small enough to avoid a conversation was a standard she'd have accepted from anyone else wearing the family's name. She didn't answer that. Instead, she asked whether this was about the money at all, or about something else entirely, something that had been building since the last reshuffle, since Catherine's diary had started filling with duties Camilla used to consider hers by seniority, if not by right. Charles told her the money was real, the fountain was real, the family still waiting for keys were real. Whatever else she wanted to make it about, he said, could wait. This could not. She stood. She did not raise her voice. She had learned decades ago that volume was a young woman's weapon, and she was not, whatever the tabloids implied, a young woman anymore. She left the tea untouched. Cold china, half-full cups, a room that stayed exactly as it was for an hour after she'd gone, because Charles did not move either. He sat with the ledger a long time, long enough for the light outside to change twice. He did not call an advisor, he called his sister. That call is the reason 4 people sat in a locked room 3 weeks later, learning secondhand what should have stayed between 2 people and a checkbook. The dismantling began quietly, the way these things always do, not with a headline but with a calendar entry deleted, then another, then a silence where a schedule used to be. Camilla's engagements office received instructions to pause all patronage-related correspondence pending review. Pending review is palace language for indefinitely, and everyone who worked there understood the translation immediately. Her assistant began drafting cancellation letters to 3 separate galas. Camilla read each one before it went out, not because she had to, but because reading them felt like the only control left available to her. She kept the letter opener on her desk through all of it, turned it over, set it down, picked it up again, a small brass ritual that meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to her. The Veterans Charity issued its own statement, thanking Camilla for years of support and confirming new patronage arrangements were under discussion. Under discussion meant Catherine. Everyone read it that way, including Catherine, who read the line 4 times on her phone before setting it face down on the counter like it might do less damage upside down. William found her in the kitchen an hour later, phone still face down, kettle boiled and forgotten. He didn't ask if she was upset. He asked whether she wanted the veterans' housing brief or whether she wanted him to fight to keep it off her plate entirely. She said she wanted the fountain gone before she took anything else. That wasn't an answer to his question. It was the only answer she had. Camilla's formal statement went out on a Thursday, 4 sentences, Palace drafted, Palace approved, containing exactly none of the words she would have chosen herself. She stepped back from her patronages to allow space for reflection and renewed focus. The sentence did a great deal of hiding. The public reaction split along predictable lines within hours. Some framed it as accountability, proof the family held even its most senior members to the same standard as everyone else. Others called it disproportionate, £40,000 against a woman who had spent 2 decades building goodwill the tabloids once swore she'd never earn. One newspaper ran a photograph of the abandoned fountain plans, beside a photograph of the Portsmouth families still waiting for their keys. The juxtaposition did more damage than any editorial could have. Camilla did not respond to any of it. She had promised Charles that much in the one conversation they'd had since the tea went cold. A short, mechanical exchange about logistics, not feeling, conducted mostly through a private secretary standing between them like furniture. They met properly 9 days later, in the garden, because gardens in this family are where the unbearable conversations happen. No cameras, no furniture standing between anyone, just hedges old enough to have absorbed worse. Charles arrived first. He always did lately. Arriving first had become his way of admitting fault without saying the word. Camilla came without the letter opener. She'd left it on the desk on purpose, which was its own small confession. She didn't need the ritual today, or she needed to prove to herself that she didn't. Neither of them opened with an apology. They opened instead with the fountain, whether it had ever been ordered, whether it could be canceled outright, whether the money could still reach Portsmouth before winter. It was easier to talk about a fountain than about 11 days of silence. Eventually, Charles said it anyway. He should have come to her before he went to Anne. He told himself he was protecting the charity. He knew, saying it out loud in a garden that had heard 50 years of his family's evasions, that he'd actually been protecting himself from a conversation he didn't want to have. Camilla said the money had been a mistake, but the 11 days had been a choice, and she wasn't sure yet which one she was angrier about. She said it without heat. Anger for her had stopped being loud a long time ago. It had become something quieter and more permanent, a room she kept the door open to in case she needed it. Neither of them resolved it there. Charles reached for her hand. She let him take it but didn't close her fingers around his the way she usually did. That's not nothing. It's also not everything. They stood a while longer, the way people do when the conversation is finished, but neither wants to be the one who walks first. The family's return to public duty came 10 days later, at a hospital opening neither headline-worthy nor small. The kind of appearance built specifically to be unremarkable, because unremarkable was exactly what the palace needed the cameras to see. Charles arrived with Camilla beside him, not behind, beside. The placement had been decided, argued over, revised twice, and finally settled by Charles himself, who overruled an advisor's suggestion that optics called for distance. Camilla wore no unusual jewelry, carried nothing that photographed as symbolic. She shook hands. She asked a nurse a genuine question about staffing and listened to the entire answer, which the nurse would later tell a colleague was the first time a royal actually waited for the answer. Catherine appeared separately that same week, opening the Portsmouth housing complex herself. Fountain quietly removed from the plans, replaced with nothing, which somehow read as more dignified than anything ornamental could have. She cut the ribbon. She did not mention Camilla's name once, and did not need to. The absence did the work the way absences in this family always do, louder than any statement could have managed. Commentators spent a week arguing about accountability versus cruelty, about whether £40,000 justified a public unraveling of a woman's life's work, about whether the monarchy had grown too eager to perform discipline for an audience that mostly wanted spectacle. Nobody outside the garden knew about the untouched tea, or the letter opener, or the 11 days that had actually broken something quietly, while the ledger got all the blame. Inside the palace, the marriage continued the way most marriages continue after damage not repaired, not ended, just carrying the weight forward into ordinary Tuesdays. Breakfasts resumed. The teacups got used again. Camilla kept the letter opener in a drawer now, instead of on the desk. She still reaches for it sometimes. She just doesn't need anyone to see her do it anymore. Thanks for watching. If this one hit different, hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next.